R.J. King. R.J. is editor of D-Business magazine, D-Business Daily, News, Tech, and Mobility News, and Detroit 500, all of which cover companies in Metro Detroit, Michigan that are expanding locally, nationally, and internationally. He also is author of 4 books: Detroit, Engine of America, which he's going to speak about this evening, Passport to the Corner Office, The Starter's Guide to Corporate Life, 8-Track, the first mobile app, and Mystical. What's that one about, Mystical?
3 short stories of 2 paranormal investigators in Detroit, both women.
Oh, cool. Since 2011, D-Business Magazine has been honored with more than 35 gold, silver, and bronze medals in the Editorial Excellence Awards from the Alliance of Area Business Publishers, including being named the top regional business magazine in the country. Very nice. Prior to launching D-Business in 2006, Mr. King was a business writer for the Detroit News. We've heard of that, yes? Okay. For 16 years, where he wrote more than 4,000 articles covering economic development, automotive, aerospace, healthcare, technology, transportation, and other business sectors. Mr. King is a board member of the Brother Rice Business Alliance, Beyond Basics, the Detroit Aircraft Corporation, the Detroit Spacecraft Corporation, ASX, and the Asian Pacific American Chamber of Commerce. In addition, he serves on the Board of Trustees for the Parade Company. He is a member of the Detroit Athletic Club and on the board of the DAC Executives Club and the DAC Car Club. He's also a member of the Boston Edison Historic District and the University of Michigan Alumni Association. In 2014, Mr. King was inducted.
Wow. All charges were dismissed.
Thank you, Jeff.
Inducted into the International Heritage Foundation's Heritage Hall of Fame. Gentlemen, Mr. R.J. King. Sorry.
Well, thanks for having me. This is my first time here. It's tucked away here at the north end of Brush Park. Yeah, so the story of the book came from the magazines. At the end of each issue of D-Business, we have a page called Closing Bell that looks back at an individual or a business sector that once was, say, the cigar industry or the shipping industry, stove industry, those things. And we kept looking for different resources to put these articles together. And it was really, over the years, it became apparent that there was no chronological history that just walked you through how we went from a French fort on the riverfront in 1701 up to 1900, birthplace of the automotive industry. There's plenty of literature out there about 1900 forward, but how did we build this manufacturing powerhouse in the middle of the wilderness? And you start to look at it in context of Detroit, founded on July 24, 1701. So it's older than the country. It's the oldest city in the Midwest. When Michigan became a state in 1837, Chicago became a city. So you can see how much further ahead we were. When the settlers first arrived, they sustained themselves on fishing, farming, and hunting. And everybody hugged the riverfront, so it was either the Detroit River, the Rouge River, the Clinton River, and other tributaries. And they moved to freight by ships, or people by ships. And the port of Detroit was established in 1798 by John Adams, President John Adams. And so the book is really just fills in that gap. It's nicely organized, so the first chapter is 1600 to 1800, and it just sets up what's going on globally with the 4 superpowers of the day in Europe, France, Spain, English, and the Dutch, and how the English and the Dutch, as we know, went to the East Coast. The Spanish went down to Florida, West Indies, and Cuba, and then the French came up and founded Quebec, and then Montreal, came and got Detroit in 1701, and then into Ohio, Kentucky, and that was all called New France. And that was to keep the English and the Dutch from expanding too far westward. So, the settlers arrived, Cadillacs the fort was financed by King Louis XIV. Under him was Count Pontchartrain. I'm sure you're all familiar with the old Pontchartrain wine cellars. So it just, that first chapter just sets you all up, or sets the reader up with that knowledge, and then just slowly just explains how we kept expanding that fort, how the fur trade drove the entire industry, and they had their priorities in order, I thought, because July 24th, day one, they start building the fort. 2 days later, on the 26th, is the St. Anne's Day, so they established St. Anne's Church. And then 2 days later, the first tavern opens. Tavern.
I didn't hear that.
Tavern.
Thank you.
And in fact, there was such a love for drinking here, and you had to have it because the explorers, you needed brandy and other liqueurs. And there were so many bars that by the 1830s, as the book cites, there was one bar for every 13 people. So as that story goes, the city council finally got the muster to try to start to regulate it. There was an uproar, and this went on for several years. And so I think finally, the 1850s, they kind of shoehorned it, so they had some regulations where the bars had to close at 2 and those kinds of things that we see today. But in any event, getting back to that first chapter, going back to that global story, so we're founded by the French, that fishing, farming, and hunting. And then we really get into shipbuilding in the 1740s, 1750s, all different kinds of ships. And then the 7-Year War breaks out, and it's England against France, Spain, and the Dutch, and England wins. So in 1763, as the book explains, the French give up control to the English of this entire territory, and Detroit is now British ruled. And they made the French, anyone that had a gun had to swear their allegiance to King George III, so farming became even more prevalent. And I think you probably are all familiar with the ribbon farms, how they extend from the river 200 feet of frontage and then 2-3 miles back. And then a lot of those are the roads that we see today after those French families, Rivard and Livernois and Joseph Campo and many of the others. And so the first fort kept expanding, and in 1778, Lieutenant Colonel Lenore called for a new fort, so they moved that a little further inward, and it was called Fort Lenore, and it's basically where the U.S. Federal District Courthouse is. And people remained in the other area. They weren't going to move, and so the War for Independence breaks out in 1776, and 13 colonies against the English, and who came to our aid? Of course, France, Spain, and the Dutch. And without their help, we would have never made it through the Revolutionary War. The French went down to New Orleans, and it took them 2 years to punch through there. And they were backfilling the Patriots' lines, and then the Dutch and the Spanish would break the naval blockades that the English had set up. And so the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, and it took until 1796 until the Americans got control of Fort Lenore, basically because the British remained behind. Communications was, obviously incredibly poor in terms of speed, and they were working with the Indians to attack settlers that were moving west. And so finally, Major General Anthony Wayne led major battles, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1795. And the following summer, Lieutenant Colonel Hamtramck showed up and took control of Fort Lenore and renamed it Fort Detroit. Its original name, of course, was Fort Pontchartrain. And then you get really into the last part of that chapter. Talks about, the first attorney arrives, Elijah Brush. We become a port officially sanctioned by the U.S. government, and in 1798, Father Gabriel Richard arrives from France and brings some measure of civility and organization to what was considered a celebrated frontier town. So you got to think everybody's hugging the East Coast for the most part, and then there's Detroit. There's not a lot of other places in the interior that people will go to, and Detroit became well known. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Great Fire of 1805. It was deliberately set at the southwest corner of the fort early in the morning, on June 9th, I think it was, with a nice wind behind it. And so General Hull, who was stationed out of Indianapolis, and he was the head of the Michigan Territory at that time, came up and found out through some investigations that somebody had bought up all the contracts at the lumber mills for the rest of the year. So he canceled all those, and then you had to issue a permit. You had to get a permit to build anything. And the day after the fire, the 3 territorial judges arrived that were appointed by President Thomas Jefferson, and they immediately took control. The mayor resigned because he had no power, and so they appointed a new mayor, and he resigned right away. And so for the next 20 years, these 3 judges, led by Judge Augustus Woodward, pretty much ran the town. And so as you know, he designed the grid system, partially after Washington, D.C., and partially after Paris, but uniquely Detroit. It has been modified from the original spot. He had Grand Circus Park really as a complete circle park, where to the north you would have had diagonal streets radiating. And I'm kind of glad he didn't do that, because I think the grid system's easier. And people still to this day complain that it's very difficult to navigate in downtown Detroit because of this design, but it's very nicely walkable. And so, by 1807, 1808, the town, everybody kind of, for that first winter after the fire, they huddled in the other fort, and then they cladded the streets in October of 06, and then, in a couple more years, they had more than 300 wooden structures built, and the first immigrants arrived, which are the Irish, because they were being persecuted on the East Coast, because they were Catholic. The French are Catholic, so they came here, welcomed in open arms. The French even shared the church with them until the Irish could build one of their own. They actually did concentrate on the east side of Woodland initially, and then through growth, their church was moved to basically Michigan in 12th, and it lasted there for a couple more decades. And then that church, which we know as Most Holy Trinity, was moved to, what was that, 5th and Porter there? Yeah, down by the old Greyhound bus station. And then over time, they got the funds and they built a new church around the old church, and then just destroyed the church inside, and you have what you have there today. And then, of course, Porktown, the oldest neighborhood, established in 1832. But after the Great Fire, Father Gabriel Richard, 1810, brings the first printing press. We start to get some books, but everything else there were no newspapers or anything like that. And then, again, global conflicts impact Detroit again. The War of 1812, which was often considered the Second American Revolutionary War, broke out. Basically, the French and the English were fighting. We, of course, were supporting the French. So the English confiscated our ships, confiscated our men into their navy. We declared war. That war went on for about 2.5 years. Detroit was surrendered to the British. Governor Hull at the time. The British were stationed down at Fort Amherstburg, aligned themselves with Chief Tecumseh and several other tribes. And so the Native Americans came in from the north, and the British came in from the west, and the white flag went up pretty much right away. Hull was later put up for court-martial and would have been executed but for his service during the Revolutionary War. But in any event, we won that war. There were some great battles that the book gets into on Lake Erie with Admiral Perry, and And then finally, as the British and Tecumseh are on the run, they're chased up the Tecumseh River there in Canada by Windsor, and a call went out for more men to end this conflict. And the governor of Kentucky brought up twice the number of men than needed. I think it was a brigade of 2,000 plus, and so they did actually. Tecumseh died in that battle, and that pretty much was the end of Native American warfare against any settlers, Detroiters, and other people. So the fort that I mentioned had been renamed Fort Detroit, but for thanking the governor of Kentucky, Governor Shelby, they named the fort Fort Shelby in 1815. So if you ever need to know where the fort is, it's right at Fort in Shelby. And like I said, where the U.S. District Courthouse is. And there's actually a plaque on the east side of the building, I believe. And so now we get through that war and we start to like catch steam. And you see the University of Michigan, founded in 1817 in downtown Detroit, on Bates Street, roughly where the water board building is, two-story white clapboard house. Father Gabriel Shard was one of the co-founders, along with Lewis Cass and a handful of others. Lewis Cass was the first territorial governor after the War of 1812, and he stayed there until 1830, 31, and he handed it off to Governor Porter, but his young aide, Stevens T. Mason, who became the first governor of Michigan, was his aide, and Porter kind of just let him run things. And as you know, that Mason is still the youngest governor of a state in the history of the country. And the first sitting president, Monroe, arrived in 1818, came up from Lake Erie, got up to Wyandotte, came in on a barge from the presidential ship, and he and his wife were escorted up to Detroit. The town, of course, went wild. It was a 5-day celebration, and 4 sitting presidents have visited Detroit up until 1900. And I'll get to the one president that lived here, but not when he was in office. So you start to see Detroit grow. We start to get into building hearths, which are little stoves in the middle of a room with a smokestack through the ceiling, and then more elaborate stoves that you're familiar with. And what really propelled the growth of Detroit was the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. So from Buffalo to the edge, eastern edge of Lake Ontario, you take a barge and then you get on a ship and get to Lake Erie and then up to Detroit. People figured out pretty quickly that at that time New York was the stove capital of the world. And people figured out pretty quickly, why do I need to bring a stove on a barge on a ship to get to Detroit when I can buy one there? So we became the stove capital of the world. And again, you know, people just came here in droves in the 1830s. It was so bad during the summers that people would be staying on the ships for up to 2 weeks until suitable housing could be found. Quite a number of other people just bought their supplies and kept moving west. And then we get into 1830s, and as the book explains, we get into railroad building, agricultural equipment was huge. You get the first vestige of mechanical, business products like an early typewriter device that was invented here. And then, of course, we were blessed with natural resources, iron ore, magnesium. We started to see industry get bigger and bigger and hugging that river the whole time. So you had mills and foundries and brasseries, and the citizens really had a hard time finding any kind of elbow room on the riverfront.
Sure.
And so Belle Isle over time became more and more popular, and as you know, that became our sort of central park, if you will. Originally designed by Olmsted, but a young designer that was working for the city took over, and much of his design is what you see there today. Belle Isle was originally Hog Island because the farmers would take their animals there, especially during the summer, to keep them safe from wolves and coyotes and other things. And of course, they didn't want to see the city take over the island because they weren't paying any rent for bringing their animals over there. So we see the railroads built up, Michigan becomes a state, and then into the 1840s, we start to begin building Fort Wayne. You start seeing the first vestiges of seed company with Dexter Ferry. You're just starting to get into medicines and things like that eventually became Park Davis, that eventually, as we know, became Pfizer, or was acquired by Pfizer. And 1849, the Fort Wayne brought a very notable person, Ulysses S. Grant. He came in 1849 with his wife and young daughter, and there was not suitable housing yet inside for the officers' quarters, so they were allowed to reside in a home just outside the fort at Fort in Livernois. And that house over time has been moved to Michigan State Fairgrounds, and now next summer, it's going to be moved to Eastern Market. And as I understand it, the site is, if you're coming out of the Roma Cafe, and to the left there's that open field there. I think they're going to put it there, and they're going to really make it nice and bring school groups in there and have educational activities, so that'll be very nice. So Grant really enjoyed his time here. A minister pulled him aside very early and told him not to drink, and he did not drink while he was here. He and his wife went to all the fancy parties, and he, as his lieutenant, cited in his memoirs, which is in the book, Grant was the best horseman in Detroit and had the fastest horse, and they would Saturday afternoons race up and down 4th Street at that time. And again, it's a dirt road, so you got to remember, I mean, roads were really, really hard to come by in those early years. And so, as the book says, Grant went on to, in 1851, was transferred to Maine, and then from there, in the mid-1850s, he was transferred to Portland, Oregon, and as you know, the Transcontinental Railroad didn't open until 1869, so that trip must have been months of just, wow, very hard to travel in those days. And he was caught drinking on the job, was given a choice of either being court-martialed or resign his commission. He resigned his commission. 1861, the Civil War breaks out. He convinces the governor of Illinois to give him charge of a brigade, and Grant just fought. He didn't care about politics. Some of the other generals under Lincoln were biding their time for the 1864 presidential elections. Grant would have none of it, and as we know, he grew to become general of the U.S. Army, and after the war was over in 1865, he returned to Detroit for 5 days. Major celebration. I guess if you wanted to go back in a time machine, that might be the time to do it. And then, as he went on to become president, even in a sour mood, if anybody mentioned Detroit or they were from Detroit, his mood just lightened, and he would embrace that individual, and really just loved Detroit. And so now we're getting into the 1850s. We're really starting to just grow this industrial, this base, and now you're starting to see factories coming off the river and going out to the green space. But in short order, you would see neighborhoods built up around the factories because the workers had to walk to work. And that was a pattern that he kept going and going and going in Detroit because, yes, we were blessed with being the largest manufacturing economy in the world for that entire century, but at the same time, we kept gobbling up land and more land and more land. And into, the book does cite it a little bit, but by 1925, the city was at its current size of 139 square miles. They obviously annexed everything in sight, other than Hamtramck was able to hold on, and Highland Park, and they're kind of considered, as you know, island cities. Throughout, just to jump ahead and explain, this is what people always ask, why is Detroit the way it is, and it took me a while to figure it out, but, as this industrial base kept expanding and gobbling up land, all of a sudden, we're the automotive capital of the world by far for decades into the 1900s. And then outbreak of World War II, we basically have to double our capacity to produce tanks and jeeps and warplanes and munitions. You see the first freeways pop up to quickly deliver these parts and back and forth. Of course, the Davison is the world's first freeway. And you look at the U.S. tank plant that was built by Chrysler beginning in 1941. The reason it's at 12 and Van Dyke is because that was the next green space. And then as the war ended, thank God we won it, but that half your demand for industrial supplies goes away, and we're left with all these factories. And so the economy starts to turn around nationally in 1950, and moms and dads are looking down the street and seeing an empty factory, and then they're hearing about these new homes that are being built up in the suburbs. And so the city's population peaked in 1951 at 1.8 million, and it was steadily going down. And then the 67 riots just accelerated it. And so now today you have 4 million people living out in the suburbs and about 700,000 living in the city of Detroit. And that's basically where we're at. I think the mayor's doing a good job. Finally, we have a decent city council and a decent city government. And, we're getting into those neighborhoods finally. It's going to take a long time, but it's coming. But getting back to the book, so after the Civil War, we had built up our capacity to help supply the war front. The women that remained here built all kinds of needed supplies and uniforms and things as well that were supplied to the front. And in this instance, after the Civil War, more and more people came to Detroit, and we had such a buzz. I mean, it's like the buzz that you see today, I would imagine. And people like, Mayor Hazen Pingree. He was a cobbler by trade, grew up on the East Coast, was in the Civil War, heard about Detroit from a buddy, came to Detroit afterward, bought into an existing shoe company. He was an amazing salesman, and there's story after story. After that, same thing with R.L. Polk, with the city guides that he started in 1870. He also came here from after the Civil War. And on and on and on with the other names. So not only does the book talk about how this city was built out of the wilderness, but also all the interesting people along the way. So, like I said, that first chapter is 1600, 1800, and then every chapter after that is by decade, 1800, 1810, and on, and it just marches you through how the city was built. 1870s, 1880s, we really start to get sophisticated. You're starting to see the growth of major newspapers. There's more than 300 periodicals. We're really getting good at marine engines. We had started building steam engines in the 1820s. And of course, all the elaborate stoves. And it was very much like the heyday of the automotive industry a few decades ago, when you had multiple models and multiple colors, and the families that ran the stove companies said it was just like from season to season, or from year to year. I mean, you kept changing your designs to get people interested in buying them. It was very intensive business. And so as we get into 1880s, 1890s, you're really starting to see bicycle makers come here, horse and carriage builders, coach builders. You're seeing the medical practice start to mature from just the doctor that calls at home to hospitals. The first sort of major hospital, I suppose, would be Harper Hospital. And there was a gentleman that Mr. Harper owned land both here and in Philadelphia. And toward the end of his life, he bequeathed a large amount of money to build the first Harper Hospital, and had it in there that he had a house there that he would live next door for free until his death. And then his housekeeper, who wasn't well liked, but when she gave up her business at the Central Market, she became very nice, and she bequeathed quite a bit of money too to get the first women's hospital going. And I also wanted to explain the cover of the book, and what you see here is the skyline from Can I see that? Okay. From 1889, you can see Grand Circus Park right here. Central Methodist Church is still there, that was built in 1862. St. John's Episcopal Church is there. Everything else is pretty much gone. These two sort of play fields here where the Tigers started, so this was like recreational area up here, and then the Tigers eventually moved to an area down where the MacArthur Bridge is, to entrance to Belle Isle. And then, of course, they moved to Michigan and Trumbull and took over where the first vestiges of the Detroit Zoo had started. So our team, to try to tell the story in a symbol, we came up with this medallion design. So again, as I mentioned, the book takes the reader from 1700 to 1900, and it shows how the French settlers started building, wagons and log homes, and then ships and steamships, and I mentioned the locomotives and rail cars. We built these thousands and thousands, used all over the country, as well as the rail bars. And then finally, in 1896, the horseless carriage. The first to have a motorized vehicle on the streets of Detroit was Charles Brady King, no relation. And he built what we would call the quadricycle, and trailing him that young March, or that early March evening around 11 o'clock at night, just to not scare the horses, but he came up and down Woodward and then a little about Jefferson, and then came back to his shop that was over on
Bagley, I think it was a Bagley.
yeah, Bagley, thank you. And trailing him on a bicycle was a young engineer by the name of Henry Ford. Henry Ford borrowed some of the parts from King's Park for his quadricycle, and then as Henry, as we know, it took 3 companies before the Ford Motor Company took off in 1903. And then each of these quadrants here reference the spoke on that vehicle, and we gave this a pearlesque effect to make it pop off the page. So for the book signings, what we've been doing is taking this symbol, we had it made into a stamp, and so you get your choice of red or black ink, and with the pad here, we just stamp it here and then sign away. We built the book like a journal to evoke sort of a fieldman's guide or an explorer's guide to Detroit. So it has the rounded corners, hardbound, glossy cover. I didn't want a slip cover because one little tear and it's basically ruined. And then it has a nice red silk page mark ribbon as well. So it's really a really good book that you read, and it gets you, by the time you read the book, you're an expert on the city of Detroit. And that history, and like I said, Detroit is unlike any other city in the world because of this manufacturing heritage that we have. Still to this day, you can build pretty much anything, and I've kind of coined it, Detroit's like this ultimate maker city. Because literally you can build anything here, and we've all heard those stories of people that come here because they can't get their product built anywhere else, especially to specifications and type tolerances and all those things. Scott, how am I doing good on time?
Just fine.
How much? It's 9 o'clock now.
You're good.
You're
Okay.
good.
Really good.
Yeah, no one's snoring, you're good.
Okay. So some of the other interesting stories about Detroit's founding, like I mentioned, Hazen Pingree. He was probably the most famous person during the second half of the 1800s. During the first half was Lewis Cass. He went to join Andrew Jackson's administration in 1830, and he went on to be secretary in different capacities, and he was actually alive when the U.S. When the Continental Army won in 1782, and then Pingree for the second half of the 1800s. Like I said, he had built up a major shoe company, and in the middle of the 1880s, he was a major strike against his business, and it was there that he admitted that he went from being a hard-bearing corporate capitalist to having an understanding of the plight of the common man. He ran for mayor and was elected in 1889, and immediately was loved by the people. He took on the monopolies that had built up in the electrical business, the water business, the natural gas business, and the public works, and cleaned quite a bit of that up. Did put the city into those businesses. Over time, that model, of course, didn't work, and we have some more of our modern utilities today, although the government does take care of infrastructure. And Pingree was so open to what was going on in the world that during the 1893 financial panic, he allowed citizens to farm city-owned lots, hence giving him the name Potato Patch Pingree. His statue is in Grand Circus Park on the west side, along Adams, and directly across Woodward is Mayor Mayberry that succeeded him as mayor in 1896, I believe it was. He ran for governor, Pingree did, and won. Unfortunately, he tried to keep his mayoral position at the same time. And it went to the Supreme Court, and he lost, and so Mayberry came in. And Mayberry was more of a, I would say, open to business minded mayor. And there was quite a number of people that wanted to limit the demand for automobiles during his reign, and the city council tried to set a speed limit of, I believe it was 12 miles an hour, and on the third reading he kind of just quashed it and pushed it away. So he did allow for the auto industry to grow here, but those two men were bitter rivals, so it's ironic to see their two statues, and they're kind of somewhat looking at each other, but not quite if you look at it, but it's kind of humorous. I kind of laugh every time I walk through the park. And then, you know, on the, for women, nursing really after the Civil War became an occupation that they started to do 9 to 5. They had quite a number of nursing colleges in Detroit. You had all kinds of benevolent organizations, of course this club itself, and you know, the YMCA, and the Knights of Columbus, and of course globally, but you know, we had quite a, even in starting in the 1700s here, the Masons were quite active, and they actually paid for a few things over the years that that helped provide places for the homeless. You know, the newspaper industry was quite active. The Scripps family is probably the most famous. James Scripps, the founder of the Evening News at the time, and his brother and sister, Ellen Scripps, quite a dynamic family. And you know, they were competing head to head with the big boys, and you know, they got into Cleveland and many other cities, and were quite wealthy and quite active, and were one of the main drivers of starting up the Detroit Museum of Arts, which was the forerunner to the Detroit Institute of Arts. And that was on Jefferson, basically just east of the Ren Center. And it was built, I think, with iron floors, if I remember right, because you know, they were so deathly afraid of a fire breaking out. And then, you know, the you know, Bernard Stroh, he came over in the 1840s, which Detroiters, I don't know who came up with the idea, but they were very close followers of what was going on in Europe. And throughout the 1800s, there were kind of a lot of unpopular leaders throughout the European countries. And so Detroit, they would make up these leaflets and go into, say, Germany, and they would leave these leaflets in bars and taverns and where people were gathering. And they were saying, come to Detroit, you know, and we're looking for professional tradesmen, and we've got all kinds of like doctors and engineers and draftsmen. And so that's, you know, people like Bernard Stroh and those others, famous names. Some of the older families that are still here, the Buell family, I believe arrived in 1835, 1836. They were furriers from New York, and they are the only family that, two brothers actually were at separate times mayors of Detroit. And they've got into, they got into railroad building, shipbuilding, eventually airplane building. And today, they're into racing, as you may know, with Robbie Buell. And they were the ones that actually sold the factory at Michigan and 12th Street, where Ford Motor Company now has about 250 people on its Project Edison team, and they're the the harbinger of what we're going to see as the train depot gets developed, and they're actively at that. That'll be restaurants and public space and art galleries and community activities on the first floor. The floors up until like 7 or 8 will be offices, work labs, and then at the top will be a sort of a boutique hotel hospitality experience. And we could all be there one day at an event, some sort of a social gathering or a business gathering of some type. And then the warehouse, originally the Roosevelt warehouse, named after Teddy Roosevelt, that'll be all like lab space. There's a tunnel that connects the two. And then the Alchemy building that's behind the factory, that has since been torn down. They're remediating the land. And that'll be another sort of lab space going in there. So 2022, 22 is kind of, you'll start to see that come to fruition. So that's exciting. And that train station was built in 1913, but all the train stations are talked about in the book where they were, where you see Wayne County Community College. That was where the train station was. On the north end of the building is where the train activity was, and as you went to the river part of the building, that's where ships came in, so they were transferring freight and passengers there. And there was a major fire on the front end, but the shipping yard and docks there, that operated up until the 1940s, 1950s, and then eventually, as we know, became Wayne County Community College, and then Joe Louis there. I mentioned that if you know your early history, when the settlers arrived, where Lafayette Park is right now, that used to be a large pond, and there was a river called the Savoyard River that went from there, headed west, and then where the riverfront apartments are, it turned right into the river. And over time, the citizens used that as a dump, and eventually that became the city's first sewer. And they charred the bricks and lined it in, and that really cleaned up the town. The river's edge at the time that Cadillac arrived was about a 20-foot bluff, so excellent defensive position. But over time, people would throw their trash over the bluff, and the farmers would dump manure and things in the river, and over time they put regulations in place to keep the river as pristine as possible. And the first fort I mentioned in 1701, if you know where the 150 West Jefferson building is, that's where it was. And the land that's between there and the river was filled in over time, and part of that fill included Fort Shelby, which was torn down in 1828 and basically pushed over that bluff, and over time that all settled up to the river, and we see the edge today. Geographically, there's 4 bluffs that move from the river up to Adams Street. So if you start walking from the river to, say, the Detroit Athletic Club, you're going to notice that you're kind of walking upward. And if you've been on any of those handlebars that you see downtown with the writing, the bars, it can be kind of difficult if the girls aren't pedaling. But they do have a little motor on all these things. The book is, just go on and on about, the musical instruments that were made here, especially the pianos and the organs, were of global quality, such to the point mentioned twice that Queen Victoria bought piano organs here for some of the islands that the British owned in the Pacific. And so, we have the whole world coming here, and, to much of an extent, they still do. I'll just comment a little bit about what's going on in the mobility space. But as we move forward, you're seeing electrical cars, you're starting to see 5G come out. What you'll see is DSRC as a thing that'll be introduced next year. It's a spectrum on the radio that isn't much used, controlled by the government, and basically with a firmware upload of all our cable boxes and our Wi-Fi boxes, it would be able to broadcast a channel. And so for a tax break each year, if you agreed to have that as a service, you would be contributing to the communications platform for these autonomous vehicles in urban areas. As we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, there was some concern that Apple, Microsoft, Google would build a car. Still haven't done it. Very difficult. And so you're seeing a lot more alliances between Silicon Valley and Detroit, and you're seeing a tremendous amount of partnerships between Detroit and Israel, which is another mobility center. There's about 7 or 8 mobility centers around the world, and having Detroit and Silicon Valley working together is a lot stronger position than trying to beat each other up, because you're competing, with Stuttgart and Seoul and Shanghai and of course Tokyo, and so I think we have a pretty good shot of being not only a leader on the hardware side of actually building vehicles, but also on the communications side. So I think that bodes well, and I think I get a lot of questions about, are we going to have another recession? Well, I don't see it. China, yes, has slowed down, but we have low energy prices across the board. So you're always looking for something that goes out of whack to cause a recession. So we all know the housing market got way out of control, and especially the mortgage industry, in the lead up to the last recession. I don't see, people are just, there was a big report in the Wall Street Journal, I think today, or yesterday, that it said that, people are just not moving like they used to. And, years ago, in the 90s, into the 2000s, I think we all, who are homeowners, saw our homes sometimes going up, $3,000, $4,000, $8,000, $10,000 a year. People start flipping homes. And we're just not seeing that today. And then, with fracking, that's really changed the game from a global standpoint, because now we're a net energy producer. And if whatever OPEC does, it's not really going to affect things, because what these frackers have done is they just keep going and going and going and opening these wells, but they don't tap them, or they tap them and then they just wait, and then when the prices start to get up a little too high, they open up more wells. Have you seen price of oil get even close to $70 or $80 in the last 3 or 4 years? I think we got a pretty good handle on things. And I think there's 2 major accelerators that are going to come to our nation's economy. One is if Congress can get in their act together and sign the U.S. Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada. That's going to bring a lot more jobs here, and work and manufacturing. And then whenever they can get this trade dispute with China, that's going to be another accelerator for our economy. So I don't really see a recession coming in the foreseeable future. And I think, Detroit's position, you're starting to see, I'm very encouraged. I've been watching this city for almost 30 years now, and you're finally seeing they focusing on the education, on the public schools. You saw a $10 million tech vocational training school go at the Randolph School on the west side, then the Beaupart on the west side, with the $2.5 billion expansion of the Chrysler plant on the east side. Southeastern High School is now going to get a $10 million tech and vocational school. So they're realizing, number one, that not every kid is destined for a 4-year university. Community college, vocational training, is all there for those students. And Dr. Vitti, who grew up here, was down in Florida. He was hired in 2017. Really has clean house. And because of the grades are starting to go up on a statewide testing, you're starting to see the unions being cooperative. And they realize that they've been a big problem in not providing a quality education to these students. I mean, when I bought my house in Boston Edison 25 years ago, you worried about the occasional guy on the street in a hoodie taking pictures of the homes and then, you know, calling on his cell phone. And now it's kids in hoodies with the earphones, and they look like they just walked out of GQ magazines, and they got the book bags and they're going to school. That's a game changer. The school board has balanced its budget the last 3 years. They have a $30 million reserve. And you're seeing a capital campaign now being led by Kelly Illich, Brooke Fisher, and Emily Ford to raise $33 million to get every high school student in Detroit reading at grade level. And then they're also, you know, working on the math, and there's another trade school for aviation that just returned to Detroit City Airport. You'll see Amazon put over a sortation center over there because the railroads to the west of the airport are going to sell off that land. You know, so slowly but surely you're seeing these schools really becoming community centers. The adults are starting to use the schools in the evening. For instance, the demand for nurses is so high that Beaumont is actually financing classes at Southeastern High School and 2 others. So that bodes very well. Again, our great economy has created very low unemployment, and you're really starting to see businesses become incredibly active in improving what's going on in Detroit, because that is, you know, a jobs garden, if you will, because of you know, our weather. You know, not everybody wants to move up north, but at the same time, I think I'm really encouraged about what I'm seeing in Detroit. The mayor is starting to get into the neighborhoods. Like I mentioned, these community centers are becoming much more active. And the other thing is the block clubs. There are more than, I think, 3,000 block clubs now in the city, and that's a tremendous asset, because now you have people on the ground taking care of these blocks every day, getting the city to do what they need to do, beautifying boulevards, cleaning up the alleys, making sure they're clean, making sure that the lights are changed. The lighting has just been a game changer as well. That whole program started under Mayor Bing. But getting back to the book, that the basis of the city's founding and its growth really explains where we're at today and where we're going, because you could talk about all the software products and apps and all those things, but somebody's got to build things. And thank God we've got a city that builds things. Mm-hmm. And I think people and Detroiters take great pride in knowing that when the time comes that the call goes out for you know, manufacturing might, you know, we've been there for every war and that this country's had, and we will be. Hopefully, it never happens again. But I think we all. I think in some respects we don't appreciate what we really have as much as we should, and I think we should be, you know, better ambassadors for our city as we travel, and not say, you know, I live in Centerline. Nobody knows where Centerline, Michigan is. Detroit, right? Oh, Detroit. And Detroit's like, after New York and LA, it's the best known city in the world. So, in terms of the United States. So I think I'll kind of end it there, Scott.
Yeah.
Well, any questions? Yes.
In your introduction,
there was a question, you were mentioned to be part of an aircraft and a spacecraft organizations.
Yes.
Would you tell more about that?
Yeah, so Territorial Aircraft Corporation is initially got started in 2011. It was originally set up to bring the Red Bull Air Races here, and that was a successful venture. But the insurance was getting so high on Red Bull, they pulled out globally for a few years. So the company refocused on building drones and did that for several years. And now Detroit Aircraft and ASX, which is a sister company, which is Aerospace Experience Technologies, is building a full-scale model of a, call it an Uber aerial taxi. So it would be a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft with a fixed wing, 2 engines on each side, rotate 90 degrees, beautiful cabin for 4 people, plus 1 more seat for the pilot. The business model is that you fly into LaGuardia. It would take you more than an hour to get to Manhattan in a ground vehicle. You would take, you and your luggage would go on to this Uber taxi. It would take you 7 or 8 minutes to get to a parking deck, atop of a parking deck on what would be known as a vertiport. You land in either this ground vehicle to take you to your final destination, or you walk to your final destination. And that would be about $100 one way. So you can see that that business model works right away. And it's actually a little easier to do autonomy as we go forward, and communications in the air than it is the ground, because there's not as much interference. And then Detroit Spacecraft is set up, as you may have read, the Michigan Aerospace Manufacturing Association, which is out of Sterling Heights, is working with Michigan and federal officials to do very light or small rockets that would take up satellites. They're about this big, a little bigger than a football. And because of our proximity to to get out of the atmosphere, it makes economic sense as well. And so you'll start to see some of that happening. But that's all based at Detroit City Airport in the former passenger terminal on the 2nd floor of the main terminal. And you've seen the aerospace school just return there. And those kids can become, you can get your pilot's license 17, I believe. And, or, you get into ground control or operations or whatever it might be. So that's kind of what all that's about. Yes, sir.
You said that you thought the neighborhoods would come back. Do you think that they'll really be repopulated with family homes? And how will that happen? What's going to move that?
So I'll tell you a story, and I think you guys have probably seen this in some of the things that you've read over the years. When a community starts to come back that has been underutilized or abandoned or whatever you want to call it, the first group of people that come back are the artists. Why? Because there's all kinds of space, and there's cheap rents, right? And in some cases they buy the buildings. And then other people come in and follow them, and then eventually the artists move on. And so I was talking to an artist, and she just sold a building that she had in Eastern Market, and I said, well, what are you going to do next? And she says, well, I bought a couple buildings on the west side of Detroit. And I said, where were those? And she says, over at Dexter and Davison. And I'm like, what? And sure enough, I drive by there every once in a while as I get out to 96, and you can start to see, I drive through the neighborhood, I'm in basically the middle of the city, and I have a lot of back ways to get to the freeways, especially during rush hour when you're trying to get to events and things. And it's amazing what's going on. I mean, again, I'm not saying it's going to be done tomorrow, but the educational base, once you get that really, really solidified, and that people really can trust that they can send their kids to these elementary and middle and high schools. The charter schools have been very successful too in the city. And they're giving the Detroit Public Schools a good run for the money. But I actually should say that the Detroit Public Schools has their own charter schools too. So, yes, sir.
This is a historical question. I remember when I was a young man or a kid, there was a stove, this model stove that I think was on Woodland or something.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever happened to that
It
stove?
burned down at the state farm, state farm.
So that stove, I think it was the Garland Stove Company, and they were at the Uniroyal site. That's where that was, and then eventually that moved to the Michigan State Fairgrounds, and and then it was struck by lightning, and it burned, and they never put it back together. But it was kind of made of wood. It wasn't. It looked like it was all metal, but it was wood.
It was for the 1893 Columbian Expedition. They built that in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
For the expedition in Chicago.
Okay. Oh, and I should mention that, yes, we all know the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, famous, you know, really one of the big movements of bringing the agrarian society into an urban society. But Detroit had its own World's Fair in 1889, basically at the convergence of the Rouge and the Detroit rivers. And that went on for 3 or 4 summers. Very successful. Harper's Weekly did an amazing illustration of it. And you could see like ships coming in with people and the railroads coming in with people. I would like to have seen it. And they had all kinds of, you know, tracks for horse racing and canoe racing and all different kinds of things. Yes, sir.
The Detroit Aircraft Company indicates to me that we have a mutual friend in John Riminelli.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
And that, I was gonna say to you, just by way of local color, you talked quite a bit about the War of 1812. This club celebrates as its patron saint, President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, who was, that's the other part of the War of 1812 down south. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. What I really wanted to ask goes back to the aircraft. There was early on in Detroit, well in the early part of the 20th century, an aircraft industry in Detroit. Stinson was one name that was, I just wondered what you wanted to comment about.
The Fuel family.
Yeah.
There was, of course, Ford got into the business as well. So yeah, we were in the teens. We started to see aircraft. Of course, at the time, you know, still wood framed and canvas wings and things like that. But we were able to bring rigidity into that industry with the use of steel. And of course, the tri-motor that came out in 1925, built by the Ford Motor Company, really proved out that you could have reliable commercial and freight traffic. And Detroit Aircraft Company actually was founded. One of the co-founders was Henry and Edsel, and the gentleman from Stinson and a few others. I can't remember all the names now.
Stout.
Yes, Stout. Yes, thank you. And they built tri-motors. I mean, it was a big industry here. And they actually, in 1929, Detroit Aircraft was probably had about 15 or 20 brands underneath it. And one of them was Lockheed Aeroplane Company. And then the Ford family, during the Great Depression in 1932, basically dissolved Detroit Aircraft Corporation. And so John Riminelli was able to restart that in the late 2000s. And then Lockheed was sold off, I believe, for $40,000 or $50,000. And they went back to California, and then I think in the 1990s, they merged with Martin Aerospace and became Lockheed Martin.
Yeah.
So we had an amazing aviation industry here, and then of course the B-24 Liberator bomber that was built at Willow Run, you know, during the 40s, 8,600 units produced, one every 55 minutes at payday. Yes, sir.
I sold industrial stuff here in Detroit for 45 years. And a few things come to mind. For example, this club was founded in 1867, not 68, 1867, by draftsmen at Detroit Locomotive Works. His brother was the general manager of that locomotive works, 1867. Downriver, of course, were all the chemical plants where we pump brine out of the earth and boil off the water and come up with all kinds of valuable chemicals. Diamond crystal salt made a unique salt up in St. Mary's. You drive out Jefferson in the 19th century. There would be, of course, Stearns Pharmaceutical, Mark Davis, the whole row. That's all 19th century stuff. And during my career, that stuff was still there. And at the beginning anyway. I like to say I spent the first half of my career building industry in Detroit and the second half moving out of the United States. Well, we used to joke near my retirement that I'm really the last of the generation of people that know how to build a factory, how to make process industry go. And now that we're gone and we're retired, who's going to replace us? If we're going to have a lot of economic growth in Detroit, if it's going to be based on making stuff, who's going to do it? There isn't anybody left that knows.
Good point. Yes, sir.
Well, you know, I used to, for a number of years, I used to teach law at 2 law schools in Chicago, mainly for the irony of being a doctor that's a law school professor, like a man biting a dog.
Okay.
And I would always tell my law students, who are mainly young kids from Chicago, if I were you, I'd think about moving to Detroit. And they'd look at me like I had 3 heads. And then I would say, well, if you think of Detroit, what industry do you think of? Of course, anybody with any sense would say automotive, but they didn't know that. But if you think of Chicago, which is a beautiful town, what industry do you think of? You know, Detroit, you think of, well, that's been gone for years. So it's, and I'm asking this is just my screwy notion, but I'm asking your thoughts on this. There aren't many places in the world where an industry is based in a geographic area. If you do automotive, it's sort of centered in Detroit. They don't do as much production work here, but all the automotive engineering expertise is here. And then maybe you might say computers, Silicon Valley, maybe oil and energy, Houston, maybe medical devices, Boston. But there aren't many other places, at least in this country, where an entire industry is based. And Chicago is not one of them. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think because there's vestiges of all these business sectors that have been here from the 1800s, 1900s, and I think, like I said, you could build anything here. And if you want to start up medical devices, you don't have to go to Boston, you can come here. I mean, Ann Arbor's a gold mine, especially on the life sciences side. Oh my God.
A few years ago, there was a fear that the Silicon Valley was going to take over the automobile industry. I think they're learning how hard it is, and it's going to be the other way around.
Right.
Gentlemen, I think these discussions can take place after dinner, during dinner, after dinner.
Okay.